So thank you for just being mindful of that. If you would like to ask a question at some point, please just feel free to raise your hand, pop in the chat that you have a question, and we'll have you unmute your microphone. So thank you. So again, today we're going to be providing an introduction to forensics in supportive housing and really more generalized. You could apply this to, really any kind of setting, because we're going to give you some information about folks in hospitals where you may receive a lot of referrals from, or you may be outreaching to hospitals, because I know in Washington, there's now an initiative to kind of start the foundational community support services while people are still in facilities. And so we will touch on some of the hospital aspects as well, in terms of the types of services folks may receive in the hospitals, what diagnoses may look like, some associated diagnoses that you may see that may pose some barriers to folks when they actually leave the hospital and are expected to integrate into the community. And you have the challenging job of supporting folks in that new environment. My name is Dawn Reinhardt Wood, and I'm one of the faculty from Rutgers University School of Health Professions in the Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation and Counseling Professions. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Ken Kinter, also a professor in our department, and we are both a part of a smaller targeted project called the State Hospital Psychiatric Rehabilitation Initiative. And so we partner with the state psychiatric hospitals here in New Jersey to help them implement best practices for care in the state psychiatric hospitals, which also often includes helping folks transition to the community. So a couple of housekeeping items. Welcome. Today's webinar is hosted by DBHR through the Healthcare Authority in Washington. This is an interactive training, so obviously we encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. We're not going to force you to hold your questions to the end of the webinar. We would like for this to be interactive. If you have examples that you would like to offer, if you've had successes, if you've had challenges, feel free to bring them to the group and feel free to bring them to us. The group and Ken and I may not have all the answers, but we like when you bring that kind of real world example. It really brings life to these sessions. So the slides that you're going to see, as well as a link to the recording of this webinar, will be available in a follow-up email coming from the state of Washington after the presentation. So just as a reminder, try to mute folks as they came in and cameras are off. This is really so that we can all have the best experience in this online environment. So to ask a question, simply pop it into the chat or raise your hand and we'll have you speak from the mic, or if you're more comfortable just talking in chat, that's fine as well. And again, just to reiterate, feel free to ask questions as they arise. So I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Ken Kinter. He's an assistant professor in our department, has a lot of years working in the mental health system of care. And for a very long time was my partner in crime at one of our local psychiatric or regional psychiatric hospitals here in New Jersey, on our state hospital team. One second, I'm sorry, folks. Gotta mute a couple folks. I always feel rude when I'm muting, but please know it's with the best of intentions. So Ken has worked in a variety of settings, including crisis, inpatient, jail settings, and so he has a wealth of knowledge to bring us. He also operates a private therapy practice with his wife. They are both two wonderful therapists, and he does work a lot with individuals with addictions, and specifically, relative to this presentation, has worked with a lot of individuals who are facing criminal charges, potential criminal charges, or trying to help them with their behaviors, their thoughts, and their emotions, so maybe we can prevent interaction with the criminal justice system. And myself, I've been with Rutgers for about 8 years now, 7.5 years, and before that I worked for a long time in community mental health, primarily in supportive housing and homeless outreach through the PATH program, which is a national program, which some of you might be familiar with, also in Washington. And I like to do a lot of disaster work and research sexual health and social recovery among people living with psychiatric conditions. So that's the short and sweet of us. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today are some of the truths and the myths about forensic populations. If any of you have joined us before and this looks familiar, this is a repeat of a session that we did last year and has been requested year after year after year. So if it looks familiar, it's fine if you tune out at this point. There's not going to be a whole lot different. But if it looks familiar and you'd like to stay and you'd like to add more, that's great too. We're going to talk about the role of stigma among the population, including self-stigma. So both the stigma that they face from society and what happens internally to folks. Some diagnoses. So we're going to look at some comparisons of individuals in forensic and civil hospitals. We're going to specifically hone in on antisocial personality disorder, which can co-occur in individuals who have a serious mental illness and also may be involved in criminogenic behavior or with the criminal justice system. Not everybody, though, who may have a forensic past necessarily has antisocial personality disorder. So we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the challenges in service provision. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken for a little bit.
All right, how's it going? I'm going to
just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Will do. All right, well, first thing I'll practice very carefully saying good morning because it's good afternoon here, but good morning to all of you. Thank you for coming along. And I don't know if we have any Silence of the Lambs fans here. I'm a huge fan. And one of the reasons I brought this up is that for the last couple of years, I've worked in our forensic state psychiatric hospital. And this is what most people believe it looks like. Looks like Dr. Lecter and the gang. And the reality is that that is not the case. My experience working in forensics has been where my expectation and the reality have been pretty different from each other. For example, one of my first days at the forensic hospital, I got to see the patient population heading down to the treatment mall for programming for the day. And I saw a lot of older people. I saw people in wheelchairs. I saw people with oxygen. I saw a lot of people that looked like they had developmental disabilities, and I saw some closed head injuries. So I said, well, wait a minute here. Obviously, this is not what I'm expecting, to see. And to be honest with you, I had the exact same experience in the county jail. After working in the emergency rooms for many years, I said, oh, now I'm in the jail. Now I'm in with the people that are really scary. And 90% of the people I saw were the same people I was seeing in the emergency room for things like homelessness and addiction and, of course, a mental health background. It's no secret that about a quarter of the people in correctional facilities not just have mental illness, but have severe mental illness. So unfortunately, part of this is what comes along with deinstitutionalization, but that's a whole other topic. You can advance it. So this is what I walked in the door with. This was my thought about, okay, anybody who has a legal background, this is what's going on. They're all dangerous. They're all violent. I should be afraid. Person's going to try to take advantage of me at every opportunity. This is sort of the baggage I brought in with me. And in some cases, this is true, but in most cases, it is not. So part of my job was to kind of climb out of my headspace that I was in just walking in. So I don't know about all of you, but I think people tend to like all this kind of neat forensic aspect of it when it's on TV. Like everybody wants to be a profile. I want to look at somebody and I want to see if they're lying. I want to see if they did the crime. We leave the TV on for our dog here. So my dog has seen every episode of NCIS and CSI and Special Victims Unit. So I'm afraid the dog knows how to get rid of my wife and I and completely get away with it because she's got all this experience. So let's start out with the definition of forensics. And it's just the overlap of the clinical and the legal. Those of you who've been in the field a long time, like me, back in the good old days, we had somebody with schizophrenia, and that's what we had to deal with. And unfortunately, a couple things have happened since then. To quote my friend, Dr. Yule, he said, we made a better mousetrap and God made a better mouse. So now instead of just having a client who has mental illness to deal with, we have mental illness, we have addictions, we have subsequent medical problems, and then subsequent legal issues. And now we have more of this overlap between the correctional background and the the clinical background. And this probably applies to Washington as well. The institutions like the state hospitals are seeing a lot more people from a jail and a prison background, and it's a much newer crowd than it used to be. So some of the demographics have changed. So getting back to forensics, there's a whole field of study, which I find fascinating about this. People love doing the evaluation part, doing the assessments. Treatment is a little more difficult. That one's a little more challenging in the long term, but there's all these fields around this. And probably where they center around is recidivism prevention. You know, how do we get people out of the system? You know, from our side, it's hard enough getting people out of the mental health system. The criminal justice system is probably easier to get into and harder to get out of. So that's a challenge for a lot of people, particularly our clients. So getting back to what we were talking about before, and I'll revisit my mindset here. A lot of times how we think shapes how we feel and then subsequently what we do. So without even realizing it, we may be altering our behavior based on pre-existing beliefs. And as we mentioned before, those pre-existing beliefs may not be completely accurate. We have a video on CBT, and this pyramid is borrowed from there. And if you look at the top, we have these automatic thoughts, these pre-existing thoughts. And so these pre-existing thoughts might look something like, well, these people are criminals. They deserve to be here. They're going to hurt me if they get the opportunity. So if those are the thoughts I'm thinking, what are the natural emotions to feel after that? It's natural to feel afraid. It's natural to feel anger. And it's also, to a certain degree, natural for me to look down on these people and kind of look at them as less than, you know, that they somehow possess less humanity than myself. And that's a doorway to, you know, all sorts of mistreatment that can follow. You know, think of the Stanford prison experiment and all those sorts of things kind of give that illustration of how that mindset works. So then the feelings of fear and anger, now we shift over to the bottom left, and now here are the behaviors. And this might be, all right, well, you got to be tough with these people. You know, you can't let them push you around, or shaming them, or again, looking at them as somehow less than because of the nature of their criminal activity. And then the part that makes me the most nervous is that part where we withhold the empathy and compassion. We don't treat that person the way we would treat someone else because of something about them. And that becomes where things are bad. And then working in this field, the last part of this little loop going around clockwise is potentially traumatic events. After any incidents of violence, say in a hospital or something along those lines, we are hypersensitive to a critical incident and may overreact. I'll give you an example. In New Jersey, we had a situation where we had a child kill another child. It was a horrible situation. It was a big thing. It was on Oprah and all that. And I know for a fact that we hospitalized tons of children after that probably didn't need to be hospitalized because.
Did you want to mention what that triggered, that killing?
Basically, well, there was a lot to it, but it's public domain. It's the Sam Manzi case. If you wanted to look it up, and it was, I believe, I might have the numbers wrong, but I believe it was a 15-year-old who killed a 9-year-old who was going door to door selling things. And there were a lot of background factors in it. The police were using the 15-year-old to catch a pedophile who was grooming people online. So there was there's a lot of dimensions to it. It's an interesting read. But the point of this part of the story is we hospitalized a lot of kids right after that because everybody was the next Sam Manzi. And you know what? There weren't the next Sam Manzi. It didn't work that way. But that's kind of how we can potentially overreact to a critical situation like that.
And just to interject that, here in New Jersey was the impetus for Megan's Law, which is our sex offender registry in New Jersey. It's probably called different things nationwide, I think, but that's our tiered sex offender law.
Oh, you can change. So what we're doing here is a quick shift in mindset from those automatic thoughts of looking at the top again. You know, they're criminals, they did something wrong, they deserve what happened to them, they deserve punishment, maybe even the feeling they deserve more punishment than they're already getting. Sometimes we see that in the hospitals. So let's shift this to they've experienced things like trauma, violence, poverty. they have experienced a biased criminal justice system. And we're going to touch on that a little, but not nearly enough. And also how I treat them influences the risk of violence. Treating people with respect reduces that risk of violence, and me flexing on that person or treating them as less than actually increases the risk of violence. In fact, our colleague found that authoritarian staff is actually the leading predictor of violence, not anything that had to do with the patient. So if I'm coming at this situation with these thoughts in mind, how are my feelings going to change? You know, my feelings might be more one of compassion. Still doesn't hurt to have a healthy sense of fear there for your own well-being and that other person's well-being, but it shifts that. I'm not coming in from that position of I'm better than or they are less than. And I haven't taken any humanity away from that person. And maybe even with the trauma-informed lens, I'm looking at, man, this person's probably been through some stuff that I couldn't even imagine. And they're coping the best they can given those situations. And maybe if I get to know that person a little bit more, I might be able to understand a little bit more what they're going through a little better. So then that shifts over, bottom left, communicating with the person with respect, treating them with empathy and compassion, and having the person first. You know, we talk a lot about person first language, you know, person with schizophrenia instead of schizophrenic. We are really sort of shifting away from the inmate term in the forensic hospital. I just saw an article today, I believe in New York is changing it to incarcerated persons as opposed to inmate. We in the forensic hospital struggle a little bit between inmate and patient. We've tried to lean much more toward patient, and we may even be leaning more towards something like service recipient or something along those lines, just to try to take some of the stigma out of the language. And part of what this does is we have to evaluate our own trauma around this. If we've worked in the field for a while, we've seen some stuff, we've experienced some stuff, may have even done some stuff, and we carry that little backpack around with us. And so it's important for our own self-care that we identify, you know, the incidents that have been significant to us. A big push, even in our forensic facility, is now toward debriefing so that people can put these things in their place rather than have them accumulate. You know, and you start to see this extreme burnout type behavior start to happen. So just to talk about stigma, stigma means a bunch of things. In fact, there's some fascinating presentations just about that word alone, where it comes from. And I'm going to ask Dawn for some increased information on this, but from my perspective, I always looked at stigma as from internal versus external. External is the stigma that's put on you by other people. You know this group of people, they ... that sort of thing. And that's of course not a good thing. Then the other one that we're really concerned about, and we talk about this a lot in the terms of people with mental illness, is internalized stigma. This is when I believe there's something wrong with me, or I believe I'm less than, in part because of all this external stuff I've been getting, but also partially because of the shame I've been feeling dealing with whatever. Just the idea of someone identifying as an addict, which people are encouraged to do, or a person with an addiction. But then the next part is, okay, so now what? What else does that say about me? Does that make me weak, evil, bad, defective? Dawn, I didn't know if you wanted to add something to this.
Yeah. So I wanted to add something about internalized stigma specifically, and that is one of the things that we found, and actually in some research that I was involved with ACT teams. So many of you may be familiar with assertive community treatment teams. Here in New Jersey, we call them programs of assertive community treatment to make a nice packed name for their program. So in one of the things that we found in studying ACT participants, so people receiving services in New Jersey, now keeping in mind that folks who received assertive community treatment are very often folks who have exhausted their options in the community mental health system, and to some extent in the inpatient environment as well. They're psychiatrically stable enough to be released from a psychiatric hospital, whether it's state level or community level or something usually longer term. However, they don't flourish so well in the community without a lot of supports. And when I say a lot of supports, I mean these integrated 24-hour, 7-day a week, 365 days a year teams of different discipline professionals, including vocational services, addiction services, traditional mental health services, peer support services, medical services, and so on, to keep them from going back to the hospital or being cross-institutionalized in jails, homeless settings, and so on. Well, one of the things that we found in our research, which was specifically focused on the work activities of individuals who are PACT or ACT recipients of services, because that is one of the goals of ACT, is to get people to enter or re-enter the workforce, or at least get them to start thinking about the vocational aspirations that they may have. And what we found was a stronger predictor, or the strongest predictor, of whether or not individuals in a 1-year period engaged in vocational activities of any kind. That may just be career exploration, that may be just doing a values inventory to kind of find out where their values are, where their interests are, et cetera, was internalized stigma, the level of internalized stigma that they felt or that they held about themselves as a person who has a mental illness and maybe a lot of other things. And so you can imagine how, individuals who may have a serious and persistent mental illness and who also may have a substance or process addiction, and who may also have a justice involved history or present, that internalized stigma can compound and compound. And we're not even talking about things like the intersectionality yet of race and gender and sexual orientation and these sorts of things, right? So like there can be layers upon layers upon layers of stigma due to intersectionality. And intersectionality isn't a horrible thing, right? In terms of people just happen to have all of these characteristics, but it's what society does to people that are in that, what we label as an out group. So the more out groups that you're a part of may raise the risk for you to incur stigma and then internalize stigma, right? So in our study, what we found was people who may be highly symptomatic, maybe, hearing voices every day, may still be using drugs and alcohol or engaged in their behavioral, their process addiction. When we say process addiction, we talk about things like sexual addiction, gambling, shopping, eating, those sorts of things. Regardless of symptomology, still people who had a greater number of symptoms, which we may view as much more impactful of their functioning, still fared better than those with high levels of internalized stigma. So we had folks that on the surface looked like they were really, like maybe they even had a work history, right? But they weren't working now and they just felt like they couldn't, they had no hope. And part of that was because they identified with their illness role or the patient or the prisoner role way too much. They couldn't see themselves outside that role. So that is why, like, recognizing internalized stigma and maybe even using some, there are internalized stigma scales out there that I believe are free that you can use with individuals you work with sometimes. If you're like, what is getting in the way? This person seems so competent. Like I said, they might have work history. They might have long periods of staying out of the hospital and things like that. But what seems to be holding them back? Stigma is a very powerful weapon, I would say, against ourselves. It can be, and society uses it as well. Ken, did you want to add something?
I think you just made a very good point in that it's bad enough that it exists in society, but once it becomes within the person, it becomes much more difficult. I think part of the reason why people are slow to accept a diagnosis of mental illness or addiction is the stigma that comes along with that. And if a person has already had experience with being stigmatized, the last thing you want is another. So it just makes sense to me.
Any other thing to note on this, and we could, Ken and I could go off on the cultural aspects of stigma all day. We could go into another direction. That's probably another training. We actually have talked about an intersectionality training. The other thing to keep in mind is that your culture of origin, your culture of being socialized may not be entirely the same. as the person that you're providing services to, right? So we all come, most of us in this room, I'm just going to generalize, so I'm not trying to ignore anybody, but we're in this American culture, right? We're in this Western culture. We know a lot of other cultures have been ignored, but just generalizing to like, we're within this American culture, but even within that American culture, there are ways that families deal with mental illness and their acceptance of it and their willingness to treat it very differently. In my household, you didn't talk about your feelings. We were very German. You didn't have feelings. You weren't allowed to have feelings, right? And that like and I'm sorry, I'm not picking on the Germans out there, but I feel like I can because I'm one. But we were very rigid, and you were not allowed to have feelings unless your parents permitted you to. And there was only a certain range of emotions that were like acceptable, right? And to say I might be thinking about hurting myself at 14 or 15, no, that wouldn't have flown in my house, right? So also keep that in mind that, although we share a common culture, what it looks like played out in people's families of origin and may look very different in terms of their acceptance of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, so we just kind of touched on intersectionality, but for those of you, I'm going to assume that many people have heard this term. But when we talk about it, it's really what we're talking about is where those things come together and how things like, and there's even something on here that I didn't speak of, class, so socioeconomic class. So where things like class, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, or another term might be sexual affectional status is another term that's used because or affectional status, period. It's not just about sex in terms of who you love and who you want to be with, right, in a romantic way. So, and mental illness and criminal justice involved past. So all of these things can converge to almost, I call it almost this inflection point where everything is amplified, and that stigma can become amplified, as can that internalized stigma. Okay. There are some folks who seem to have really resilient protective factors and don't take on that external stigma. That's very difficult. If any of you have found yourself in a position where, and this is just, thinking more general and light, a goal that you have, maybe big, maybe small, but you're like not sure if you can meet it, right? I don't, I want to lose weight, or I want to stop smoking, or I want to start exercising. I never really been successful at that before. Not sure if I can do it. Like that is some of the same like self-deprecating things that people with internalized stigma can engage in. I've always been a patient. I've always been in and out of the hospitals. People tell me that there's something wrong with my brain, or that I'm bad, or I feel like people make me feel like I'm bad because I was involved in the criminal justice system before, when I was not being treated properly for my mental illness or my addiction or whatever. And so this is where these kind of factors can converge. Okay, Ken?
And I'm just going to throw one other piece in about that, in that when people are in correctional or forensic settings, we human types have a natural tendency to form a hierarchy, the most powerful or most desirable down. And when you get into a correctional setting, that takes on a whole new level. People are immediately separated in different groups, say by sex, by race, age even. And then, so there's an overall hierarchy, and then the hierarchies that form. So that is its own form of culture. And when the better you get at knowing that form of culture, just like the inside of a state psychiatric hospital, the better patient you are, the more struggle you might have on the outside when it comes time to leave that structure behind. I know doing groups in a jail is very difficult because they honor the hierarchy in the group. And one of the first lessons of group is no hierarchy here. 1 equals 1 in here. I don't care how long you've been here, what you're in here for, or anything like that. And the participants in the group would remind me, and they say, well, that's not how it works out there in the tiers. And I said, that's absolutely correct. It doesn't work that way out there, but this is how it works here. And you need to remember this part, because at some point you want to go to a world where if somebody looks at you the wrong way, you haven't been punked and you now have to respond. Something.
And could you say a little bit more about, like you had said, separated by race? And I just want people to understand that that doesn't necessarily mean that the prison system or the jail system is segregating folks, but what you mean by that in terms of people seeking out groups, similar groups of people to them, or where you might feel protected.
I think people naturally seek out commonality to a certain degree. There's safety in commonality. And when you are in a place where you feel unsafe, you're immediately looking for, okay, it's just me out here. That's not safe. I need a group. And so the easiest way to connect to a group is by a visually identifiable group. I know what you are. I look at you and I know what you are. I really don't know you at all, but I think I know one thing about you. And then that's how people sort of, group up together. And we see this, I see this in the state hospitals. I see it much more in correctional settings, but you do see it. And again, I think that's a safety mechanism that people try to follow. But unfortunately, how someone looks is not necessarily an indicator of how safe they are. So there's that as well.
And I just wanted to piggyback on that and tell a little teeny tiny story about an individual that I worked with in supportive housing. It was before I became a supervisor, so I was a case manager at the time. And I was doing the jail outreach part of our program. And so my coworker and I would go to the county jail, and we would talk to mostly males, talk to the gentleman that they referred to us, the jail psychiatrist determined they had a serious mental illness. They were also homeless. The likelihood they'd be reincarcerated or end up in a state psychiatric hospital or worse, if they left without services, was really, really high. They would refer people to us at usually 4 p.m. on a Friday when the judge said, let the guy go. And you can't hold somebody, if you know anything about the jail system, once the judge says it's time to go, that person needs to go. At least in New Jersey, we're pretty strict on that. It's not, oh, you don't have a place to go to, let's hold you until Monday morning. No. So we would get the call, usually 4:30 on a Friday. See, the time just keeps getting later as I tell the story. It's like a fish tail, right? Just keeps getting bigger, but the fish gets bigger. But usually, in the evening, early evening on Friday, and we were expected to go and rescue this person and put them in a motel or something temporarily. And the person who was referred to me had a swastika on his face right here. Now, I mentioned I'm of German ancestry, and I also have a lot of members of my family who fled Eastern Europe because of said people like that. So you can imagine persons in front of me being released to me, and my coworker never went alone, being released to me and my coworker. We now have to take them and place them. And I'm like, what am I going to do with this guy with a swastika painted on his face or tattooed on his face at 4:30? Like, where am I going to, I have to take him to the Board of Social Services. This is going to be fun, right? Like, all of these things are swirling in my mind. We get him placed in an emergency setting. And I have to tell you, I was probably very, very cold. It was very early in my career. I had zero tolerance. I also had very little insight into all of this that you're all listening to now, right? After I got to know the individual, one of the very first things he asked me was, do you know any way I can get this removed? And what I found out was it was a jailhouse tattoo. It wasn't huge. It was, but it was a jailhouse tattoo. And he was doing it to fit in with the group that he found safety in, right? And this was one of the things they did. Aryans, was some kind of white nationalist, whatever, group in the jail. And, as I got to know the individual, I got to know, now I don't endorse this behavior, but there was more of that story in terms of what he felt like he needed to do to stay okay in prison or in jail. So, I don't know, that's just like my little itty bitty story. We look at surface, and we need to do that because that keeps us safe. Very often we make very quick automatic judgments about what we see on people's surface, but very often, much more often than not, I think there's more of a story as you get to know individuals. So, and I mean, the same with guys with gang tattoos and stuff, and that can create dangerous situations for individuals that are working with them. If they happen to be tagged like that, and you see, they're seen out in public with you working with them as a case manager by somebody in another gang, and so on and so forth. So there are some inherent dangerousness in working with individuals who have this kind of history, but I think we need to be aware of it. and know what to look for and know how to take these kind of safety precautions. Go ahead, Karen.
So what we have here is a comparison of the top 10, I'm a big David Letterman fan, top 10 most common diagnoses in the forensic hospital and in the civil hospital where we work. So if you go from the top here, the top ranked one, they look pretty similar, right? Schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder are the big two. Then we start to diverge a little bit. When you get to the number 3 spot, here's where you see your antisocial personality, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Whereas the civil hospital was much more interested in tamping down on smoking. So tobacco use disorder shot to the number 3 spot. But it's also interesting, as you tick down, you see a lot of addictions going on here. So you see cannabis use disorder, which actually became more common than alcohol use. I think you're going to see that societally as well. This is a good time to discuss this because New Jersey just legalized recreational marijuana. So we're experiencing a bit of a boom here. But it's interesting that alcohol or cannabis seem to be almost more of a generational thing. So that's something that's interesting. In the civil hospital, alcohol is still ahead of cannabis, but it's really close. What else do you see? We also, in the forensic hospital, borderline personality makes the top 10, and people with intellectual disabilities. So it might be a shocker, right? That's one of the top 10 things. They've committed a crime, they're in a forensic facility, but one of the challenges in these facilities is how do you look at the population that you get and separate them by, okay, who are the people that are profoundly mentally ill and have committed a crime? Who are the people that may fit this more predator sort of profile, the personality disorder profile? And then what are the other situations, such as an intellectual disability, a closed head injury, things like that, that may have contributed to the legal situation. One other piece about this is the diagnosis of personality disorders is very dicey. I'm sure you all know that the research about it is really bad. It's really hard to find consistency among those diagnoses. My informal experience has been that it's more a product of how horrified a clinician is by what that person did than their actual presentation. Oh my God, this person committed a terrible crime or a series of terrible crimes. They're definitely an antisocial personality. Well, no, it's the severity of the crime is not a diagnosis. And the same thing goes with borderline personality disorder, where, okay, just because a person's manipulative doesn't mean that they have borderline personality disorder. They may be a really good manipulator and it may really work for them. That doesn't necessarily. So some of this diagnostic stuff we need to take with a grain of salt. But my point is they're probably more similar than different diagnostically. And of course, many of the patients we've had have gone back and forth from civil to forensic hospitals. So we'll see the same people on both depending on what their presentation is at any given point in time.
I wanted to add, I think that also just anecdotally, and I don't know if anybody else agrees with this, or Ken, you would agree, being more of the clinician in the room than me, you can see some overlap in some of the characteristics between borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. And if we even wanted to throw narcissistic in there, which we don't really see diagnosed in the hospitals as much, but there can be so much overlap that it can definitely be sometimes difficult to accurately diagnose, unless you really are with someone for a long time. And the best way to diagnose a personality disorder is through direct observation and history, right? So a lot of times we don't have that kind of history on a person. If they come from the criminal justice system, we may have a whole lot more. Or if they were institutionalized for a very long time or in and out of the mental health system, we may have more. But very often we don't necessarily have the history to even be able to make that diagnosis. And like Ken said, there can be very outside the norm of what society expects, types of activities that people may engage in. Doesn't necessarily mean they meet the criteria for a disorder. And I think that we have we're very loose with our language in America, and we'll say, oh, that person's so antisocial, right? Well, does that mean they're more of an introvert? Or does that mean they like literally work towards pushing society's norms and don't have any empathy for anyone around them, can't feel empathy for someone, can't feel sympathy, right? So I would challenge people to be careful with their language. I do think that language matters. And just, on the same token, people calling, and you usually see this applied as a dig at women. Oh, she's so borderline. Or you'll even hear it with bipolar disorder. Oh, that guy's so bipolar, meaning he changed his mind or something, right? Like, these things we have to be careful, because I think that it does us harm in the clinical setting. And it really affixes these diagnoses to people that are just engaged in some bad or irregular behavior that we don't like. And that doesn't necessarily give the full picture of any of these disorders, which are typically rooted in trauma.
Mhm. So just to go over this again, because to Dawn's point, there are a lot of terms that mean one thing clinically and then mean another thing to the person on the street. When I do the new employee orientation at the hospital and I ask people what antisocial means, they say, oh, well, they just don't like being around people. And I was like, okay, yeah, that's true out there. Now let's talk about what it means in here. And just to borrow from from the DSM, here are the hallmarks that you're looking for: failure to conform to the law, repeated lying and conning, disregard for other people's safety and rights. The first one in the second column, lack of remorse or conscience. To me, that's what really sets this diagnosis off. Not that they do things, it's just that they don't feel bad about them. And there didn't have to be a motivation for them. Working with a gentleman in the jail who admitted to killing somebody with a shovel. And I was curious about why the shovel. I wasn't sure the shovel was usually the implement that you killed people with. I thought that's what you buried them with afterwards, but I don't have a lot of experience in this area. And I asked him why he killed this guy with a shovel. And it turns out it was somebody he didn't know. It was he just didn't even think about it. He just saw the person, decided he was going to do it, wondered what it would be like, and then did it. Now, he was remorseful, but he was not remorseful about the fact that he'd killed somebody. He was remorseful about the fact that his partner and their kids were now suffering because he was incarcerated. Antisocial personality disorder is predominantly found in men, not exclusively, but predominantly. It's also hard to grow old as an antisocial. It's not an easy lifestyle to maintain. Most are either dead or incarcerated by the time they're 40. I'm not big fans of the term psychopath and sociopath. I hear them on daytime TV all the time. And I'm sure we could have a really good debate about those terms, but they're not really present in the diagnostic arena. They're labels that have been kind of put on. I've seen stuff about what's the difference between a psychopath and sociopath. Okay, we don't need to complicate this, because people who have this are difficult enough to treat as it is. There's also a real significant question about whether this is hereditary or environment or trauma-based. Most of the people that I've worked with who've been diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder usually have a pretty horrific history of abuse in their background. So to me, there's a piece that feels like, they're just giving what they've gotten. But there's also some research around brain development, and that there's the area of the brain that tells you, wait a minute, you shouldn't do something, just doesn't engage. So there's still some ongoing controversy about that. The thing that I think we're most interested in working with people with antisocial personality disorder is the grooming behaviors, is the part that we're worried about. People with antisocial personality disorder tend to present in one of two ways. One is very scary. So this person gets their way by intimidation, using the threat of violence or violence to get what they want. This is a person, if you saw them walking toward you, you would find another direction to go just because you'd be intimidated. And that's part of the intent. The other part of antisocial personality disorder is someone who is extremely trusting. You hear about people who are so persuasive and so charming. They could probably sell you just about anything from a used car to alleged holy water. You would trust them to watch your house. You would trust them to watch your kids to your peril. You might even vote them into public office. And I'm going to stop there because it's being recorded and I don't want to get myself in trouble. But suffice to say, if I could shake hands with you and look you in the eye and think to myself, I'm raising your taxes and I'm cutting your health benefits, and shake your hand and look you right in the eye and say, I'm there for you, that's an antisocial tendency right there. But again, it looks completely different. So getting back to the grooming piece, which is something I'm sure that you all have to come up against, and we do in these facilities as well, is that idea of this progressive behavior of, I'm going to get away with a little something that I'm not supposed to get away with. And in the hospital, it can be as innocuous as giving somebody a pen or a paper clip. And then it progresses and progresses and progresses. And I'm sure you've heard the story about the corrections officers who've brought corrections officers' uniforms into a prison and assisted in jailbreaks. There was a situation in Alabama where a female correction officer took a male inmate and just went on the run with him. She was supposed to take him out to a doctor's appointment, and off they went. And I think they found her body somewhere not long after that. So it's this progressive thing, and especially people that are new in the field, and I was one of them, you can be taken in by this. You see somebody who's either intimidating and you don't want a problem, or you see somebody who's incredibly charming. Like, why are they even here? Why are they in this facility? Why are they in this system? They seem to be so smart, which they are. And then you get brought in. What happens is eventually the person gets to the point where they're giving things that are going to get them in trouble. You know, for example, in the forensic hospital, I saw a patient walking around with an Arby's cup in his hand. Okay, how did that happen? How did this patient get from a maximum security cyclone wired facility to get Arby's? Well, that's not how it went. How it went is he made a deal with the staff person. He was going to have a good night if he got himself some Arby's, and that's how that worked. And that's usually how it works. So grooming behaviors, I'm on a rant about that, but I mean, to me, that's one of the real important things about it.
Can I just give a little example of that, a
Sure.
first-person account of that? In the psychiatric hospital where Ken and I were both based out of for many years until the pandemic, you know, we have a forensic building, and many years ago, I had to go to the forensic building to meet with a patient and a treatment team. Met with the patient for a little bit first, and I was more kind of doing a favor because they wanted to see if I thought this person would be good for a supportive housing program. There were no forensically enhanced supportive housing programs at the time, and so because I had that history, I came over and met with the guy. And one of the things that struck me almost immediately was, why is this guy here? Why is this guy here? Now, here I am at that point. I'm 17 years into my career at that point in the mental health field. But I immediately had an affinity, a liking, had positive feelings towards this individual, right? And to me, based on some past experience, that has always been my internal sign to myself, especially when meeting with an individual who I've never met. I have no relationship built with this person, therapeutic rapport, friendship, whatever it may be, no prior history, but that immediate, like, as soon as I met this person, I had to challenge myself to remind myself of where I was because of how well the individual was presenting. And I know that sounds in a way horrible, like, people don't have the ability to present well when they're in a psychiatric hospital. Sure, they do. But it was that coupled with all of the facts that I knew about this person that kind of raised signals for me, in addition to information that Ken has taught me about individuals who have antisocial personality disorder and just how charming they can be. And some of the ways where we see this played out, especially for female staff in psychiatric hospitals, and I think in justice settings or justice involved settings, and can definitely happen in a supportive housing setting, is testing the waters, right? So, you know, and I'm sorry, I keep picking on men, but they're the bulk of individuals in our forensics settings. The guy who says, "Oh, you look really pretty today," or "I like your boots," or "That's a nice outfit," or "I like your glasses, they're cool," may seem innocuous, but it's a test, right? So let's see how this compliment goes over. And the next time I meet you, I may take it a step further and say, "I notice you don't wear a wedding ring," or "You have a nice shape," or something like that. And it's those incremental, like Ken said, steps towards the overall goal that the person has, which it may not be something sexually oriented. It may be trying to gain your trust and access to you for what you can obtain for them, like breaking them out of jail, or just simply getting them cigarettes from the outside, right? Like maybe they've seen you smoking on campus and you're not supposed to do that. Now they've got something on you and you might be willing to give them some of your cigarettes. So like little things like that you have to be mindful about, because people will exploit that. Trust.
Right, over a period of months and years. And then when you get to the point where you're giving that person something that you could get in trouble for, now they have that on you. Now that person can hold your job over your head. The last point I would make about this is it is the job of a predator to identify prey. And one of the ways you do that is by getting the herd moving. If you run at the herd, the power of the herd is in its speed and also in its ability to stay together. If there's a member of the herd that can't keep up or splits off, that's the one the predator follows. So my advice would be, when you hear this grooming thing happening, when you hear the compliments or you hear this person approaching you, stick with the herd, talk to the senior staff, talk to your supervisor, make sure that this isn't an act that this person has done with everybody before they've gotten to you. And now they're going to do it with you. And if it doesn't work with you, they're going to wait for somebody else to come along. And again, I want to stress that this is not universal, but you do see people that have this behavior and they'll go from one person to the next to the next. And your colleagues who have been there know who they are and know what their game is.
Yeah, and I like your point about it not being universal, right? It doesn't
Right.
mean that every individual, again, getting back to, it doesn't mean that every individual who has a criminal charge in their past, whether it's been adjudicated or not, is antisocial and engages in these types of behaviors. And there may be folks kind of on the spectrum of antisocial behaviors, right? So where they're not as exploitative to people where others are. So, it's just keeping in mind, like, these are things you could do to keep yourself safe or safer.
Yep. The other piece is some of this comes with the environment. Some of this is an antisocial personality disorder. Just like we said, manipulation is not all someone with borderline personality disorder. This is a way you can get ahead. If I flirt with the nurses, does that make a better chance that they're going to give me extra food if I want it? I don't necessarily have antisocial personality disorder. This is a strategy I'm using. When you are in a situation where you don't have power, you're going to try to get it any which way you can.
I've always told my kid, you get more flies with honey than vinegar. So,
The other piece I'll just add on about the culture of this is, I don't know anyone who's come out of a correctional facility, and you might be able to extend this to psychiatric hospitals as well, without at least a slight case of PTSD. If they didn't have it when they went in, they're going to have it when they come out, because of things that they've either witnessed or been part of while they were in there. So you as housing folks are getting some of that. I know people who will not dry themselves off outside of the shower. They will only dry off. They will bring the towel into the shower. They will not come out. And I don't want to hazard a reason why, but I can imagine. So there are any of these 100 little cues of something that someone picked up in a facility. The pages overhead, the constant pages overhead. I know one person who was incarcerated for a few years. He can't go into a Home Depot because they'll make the announcement overhead. Nancy, can you please report back to Register 4? He's jumping in the shelves because in a correctional facility, that means there's a riot going on. And you're trying to simultaneously get out of the way of the riot or get out of the way of the people that are coming to quell the riot. And that stayed with him. He's out 5 years now, and he's still got that. So again, part of the unenviable task that you may have, I'm less interested in you being able to diagnose this and say, wait a minute, that's antisocial. Wait a minute, that's PTSD. But to be able to field it as it comes in. Say, okay, so how can we deal with this? How do we help this person to feel safe enough that they could towel off in their own bathroom? You know what I mean? Or that they can go into Home Depot without having a panic attack every time somebody leaves their register.
And Tammy, I believe it was, Tammy made an excellent point in the chat, Ken. She said, it's interesting how much of this is also present in the military environment. So think about some of the things, and we may have members for veterans, former members of the military in our group today. If we do, thank you. There may be activities that people engage in that were highly adaptive when they were in combat, or when they were in, even if they didn't see combat. My father is a Vietnam veteran who was active duty combat, long range reconnaissance in the jungle, for weeks at a time. And they started off his enlistment by saying, if you choose this long range reconnaissance, which were like the kind of the precursors to the Rangers, you have a much shorter life expectancy. So you'll get out of Vietnam much quicker if you survive, right? So he took that option, being a 20-year-old guy, thinking, or 22-year-old guy, I can do this. Why not? Still having some of that adolescent brain where you think that you can't be killed, right? And, he came back with PTSD and a lot of behavior that looks like what a lot of people who are lay people call antisocial, though not wanting to be around others, not forming deep connections with other people, emotional connections, and these sorts of things, I think, have been leftovers of that trauma from
Sure.
combat and losing all but one of his folks in his, I always wonder, is it a troop? Is it I don't know. Platoon? I don't know what it is.
There was also something earlier in the chat about hoarding. That's the same thing.
Yeah.
How much of hoarding is maybe OCD related, or it used to be included under that? And I've met people in the hospital, they wear everything they own so that it doesn't get stolen. So this person wearing 4 or 5 coats, I used to think, oh, this guy was schizophrenia, he's pretty out there. No, he's protecting his stuff, and he's learned that he has to do that. And he's probably learned it in these facilities. So
he probably has every important document in his pockets as well. Birth certificate, divorce decree.
How much do people have to unlearn when they get out of these facilities and they get into a housing program? How much unlearning do you have to do? Because it doesn't work that way here anymore. I mean, maybe it could to a certain degree, but I consider it sort of a latent PTSD from being in these types of facilities.
And I think a lot of research has found that hoarding behaviors are rooted in trauma and anxiety. I mean, at first it was looked at as simply a type of anxiety disorder, right? And then we started looking a little deeper, and very often there's some traumatic link. It may not explain it all. And that is the thing. We even have these conversations in our project, like trauma is important, but it's not essential for a mental illness to be diagnosed or an addiction to happen, or right. But it's very often there in most people who have been treated for mental health conditions, addictions, disorders, and folks who are involved in the criminal justice system.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you guys can relate to how this comes around from several different environments: corrections, inpatient mental health, military, homelessness. I got to have all my stuff on me because that's all I got,
Right. And very often one of the things that you'll see, I don't know, I'm going to assume that you guys see this, you ladies and gentlemen see this in Washington as well, but those folks who you move from either homelessness or hospital or justice involved setting into an apartment of their very own, and yet they choose to sleep on the floor and not in the bed, or they're just living out of one room, right? Or they're not really integrated, and some of that is like them finally, I don't want to say finally, but they're in a safe spot, and they may not feel totally safe yet because they are traumatized. And homelessness, I think, is one of the most traumatic things that individuals can experience. And it's just that sense of insecurity constantly. And I think it takes a long time for people to say, okay, I'm safe in this apartment. These folks want to help me, and I can start to live now. For so long, people are just in survival mode.
Mm-hmm. I think we're getting another training out of this, Dawn. We're planting some seeds for.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So Natasha said, or they sleep in the closet, right? So they go to a place where they feel really, really secure. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Natasha, for that. And Tammy also said that almost every person that she's ever spoke with hoarding issues identifies some sort of trauma, like it might be foster care. That's a great example, right? Like in the community mental health agency that I used to work for, we had a children's like a clinical foster care, like foster home program. So kids that were in the system, in the foster care system, who had significant behavioral health challenges, which was usually a result of abuse and neglect, were placed in these therapeutic foster homes where the families or the foster parents had specialty training, and there were also wraparound services delivered to the home. And it was so sad because, I mean, for a variety of reasons, but these kids would come from, they would be dropped off. I don't know where exactly they would come from before they came to our program. They would be dropped off with a trash bag, and all of their belongings were in that huge black trash bag. And can you imagine, like, that is your world? That those are the memories you have of your family. Those are your toys if you're lucky enough to have them and to have been able to take them with you. There might be pictures, any clothes that you might have. And the director of that program realized how dehumanizing that was to kids who have already had an extremely rough start, to say the least. And so one of the things that we started doing was doing a lot, not a locker program, but like they would get like these little chests, like almost like hope chests that they could store their stuff in and at least feel like they had a safe place for it. And they didn't have to be further dehumanized by carrying around their belongings in trash bags. But very often when we transition people from the hospitals to home or to their new home, they're bringing their stuff in bags and sometimes trash bags. And that's very dehumanizing.
So I think the moral of this part of the story is anyone that you're getting from these facilities, treat them as if they have PTSD, because they probably do. And I know the rates of diagnosis for PTSD in these hospitals is abysmally low. I think we're averaging around 1%, 2%, 3%, which either means we've cured it or we're not diagnosing it very well. And I think I know which way I'm going with that. So, and again, if they didn't have it coming in the door, if their stay was years long, or if they were exposed to something amazing while they were in that facility, which is entirely possible, you got somebody with PTSD, which at that point may actually be a primary diagnosis that has to be dealt with before you can even get at all this other stuff. Because I'm not going to trust you with any of my other stuff until I'm not sleeping in the closet anymore, or until I'm not wearing everything I own every day, because I have confidence that my stuff will actually still be there when I come back.
Right. Right. And also, I think it's fair to say that although all of us here are currently or formally part of probably mental health systems of care, there's a lot of trauma that happens in the mental health system of care across our country. We don't do such a great job at meeting people where they're at, especially in times of crisis. Ken and I have both worked in crisis settings, and I would say we're probably the exception. No, I know we're not. We've made some of the same mistakes. No, and that's what I'm saying. Like, even in when you think about how people in general access emergency mental health services, here in New Jersey, the police are almost always involved in that, especially when the determination has been made that somebody may be a danger to themselves or others based on their mental health, based on their clinical presentation, and they need to be removed from the community or the home. Here in New Jersey, that happens with police intervention, and it happens in a lot of parts of our country with police intervention. So we're already increasing the likelihood that the folks that we serve, just by virtue of trying to get them adequate services to meet their needs during the time of crisis, are going to have to interact with the police in not their best moments of their life, right? So you might have somebody who's experiencing psychotic symptoms, somebody who's extremely depressed and maybe self-harming, somebody who may be intoxicated and not their, in their best version of themselves at that point in time. And now they have to interact with somebody with a gun and is coming at this interaction from a very different perspective than mental health providers. And there are some phenomenal cops out there who are specialized and trained in crisis intervention techniques, but we do know that we have a long way to go. And it's just that increase of exposure, right, can increase the likelihood of there being further criminally involved kind of stuff going on for that person moving forward, because anything can happen during that interaction with the police. So keeping that in mind, some of the things that we want to talk about, again, in relation to trauma, and that the likelihood that the individuals that you're working with who may have forensic histories or presence are probably pretty likely to have experienced trauma. One of the things that we know from several large studies, most recently, I'm going to say Yagi. I'm channeling my inner Swedish, but I'm not sure if that's I'm channeling my inner Viking, but I don't know if that's right. Experiencing 4 or more traumas. And this is on, if any of you have ever, if you're aware of something called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, it was a questionnaire that came out of a very large scale study out of California. I think at this point, there's been over 25,000 subjects or participants. And it is a 10-item questionnaire which asks the individual completing it about any adverse childhood experiences that have been shown to predict poor health outcomes, poor mental health outcomes, involvement with the criminal justice system during adulthood. These are experiences that have happened to an individual from birth to age 18, roughly. And so out of 10, the greater the number that you have, the more at risk you are for developing some life hastening or death hastening conditions, I will say. So you'll have a shorter life, or you may have a shorter life, the more of these traumas that you incur. You may have more interaction with the criminal justice system. You may have a greater risk of suicide, of substance use, of contracting a blood-borne disease that is associated with some of these risk-taking behaviors like promiscuous sexuality, IV drug abuse. We could, and then you can only imagine all of the health complications that may come from that. So experiencing 4 or more of any traumas that is contained within this list, and we could put the link in the chat a little bit later for you if you wish, is very strongly associated. You see significance level of 0.01. That means there's a 99.99% chance that this is not, or that this is not due to chance, right? So this is like very closely associated. 4 or more events of trauma elevate the odds of arrest, elevate odds of incarceration or jail at a rate of 5 times. So if you look at the elevated odds of arrest, that means 400% more likely, or 4 times more likely that an individual will be arrested if they have 4 or more traumas before the age of 18. The elevated odds of incarceration are over 500%, or 5 times. And I'm sorry, the transcription is over my elevated odds of imprisonment. 2.18, so over 2 times more likely. A few other things that I think is worth mentioning as well, and when we talk about intersectionality and how there is a role of race and socioeconomic class, I think that we should speak to how trauma can disproportionately affect, especially Black Americans. This is not to say that folks in other categories are not also at risk, but we see most of the highest disproportionality of trauma affecting Black Americans. So 1 in 5 Black children will experience maltreatment. This doesn't necessarily mean from their primary social or caregivers, right? This may be in the community, this may be environmental, as we said before, it may be societal. So 1 in 5 Black children will experience maltreatment versus 1 in 10 white children. We could go into another whole lesson on privilege and things like this, and how that may play a role in terms of buffering abuse and maltreatment from society in general, and also within families, and even things like colorism and how that comes into play within families of even the same culture. But we're not going to delve into that. And then in addition, nearly 9% of Black adults have a history of PTSD, which is 2% higher than that of whites. And so if you kind of follow that through line back to trauma, back to intersectionality and some of the systemic issues in our society, it's not surprising to see that slightly higher figure. Well, not astronomically higher, slightly higher. And again, these numbers are anywhere, the PTSD prevalence numbers are from 2011. A lot has happened since then. We've had a lot happen in America. A lot happen globally. We've seen well, let's just say it's been a pretty difficult 4 or 5 years. And I would venture to guess that the PTSD rates overall are probably higher, as people are more willing to talk about trauma, thanks a little bit in part to the coronavirus and the shared trauma that so many of us have experienced, and then how that also can compound or intersect for other groups of people. So those rates are probably likely higher. I don't know, Ken, what do you think?
I'd be afraid to look, to be honest with you.
Right, yeah. And I just think that based on, we're in a position, and maybe many of you are too, maybe you get alerts from SAMHSA or other federal funding bodies for research and services, but I get these alerts from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration at least once a month, in which they're pouring, and thankfully, pouring more money into mental health services, specifically and very often around trauma and trauma-associated conditions. And a lot of this is coming from COVID money that's around for the COVID response. So at the very least, we're getting a boost in some mental health funding. I hope it follows through to the individuals who are most in need. So the other thing that we'd like to mention, we touched very briefly on socioeconomic status. This is also a very strong predictor of the experience of PTSD and heightened involvement with the criminal justice system. You may have seen things in recent days. There's a new term that I heard about that I never knew about before, something called place-based policing or place-based enforcement. It's when a specific area of a community is targeted for policing at a very high level, at an enhanced level, and a lot of resources are thrown at it. And a disturbing thing is you tend to see this in areas, and this is some of the correlations that I'm looking at, and please don't take this as fact, but you tend to see this in areas that are on the horizon for gentrification. And if folks don't know what that is, it's kind of like the overturning of a community, right? The community gets devalued, property levels go really, 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 really low. And then people come in and offer to buy those homes and buy those properties who have a little bit of money. And before you know it, the community doesn't look like what it used to look like in terms of culture, folks living there, businesses, etc. I'm not saying I'm not one for community improvement in terms of like reinvigorating communities and that sort of things. But when these things are done in such a targeted way to oust the folks that have called the place home, and when law enforcement is kind of used as an arm of that, we're running into some problems and some unethical territory now. So regardless of race, residents of urban, low-income communities have greater rates of lifetime prevalence of PTSD. So you see that rate increase to 25%. Remember, overall, we said Black Americans about 9% lifetime prevalence, white Americans about 7%. Not a huge difference there, right? But then when you overlay socioeconomic status and geographic location onto that, all of a sudden you're looking at that rate almost tripling, doubling at the very least, and almost tripling in some cases. So, this is something we need to keep in mind, that even if you're not working with individuals coming from a forensic setting, coming from a state psychiatric hospital, Ken touched on how traumatic homelessness can be, how traumatic it can be to live in an environment. This is Camden, New Jersey, beautiful North Camden. I actually love Camden. Camden is full of a lot of history. Camden is full of a lot of amazing food, which I love, and cultural locations and diversity. This is also a street in Camden. So, right, so imagine walking out on that street every day. This is what you see. It's kind of bleak. And then add the increased law enforcement and all that on top of it, which people can feel threatened by. And residents of these communities are disproportionately likely to experience both trauma and involvement with the criminal justice system. So you're already taking a group of individuals who are pretty highly traumatized, a community where a quarter of the people living in that community, and again, these numbers are 11 years old. So we may be looking at higher rates right now. I'm hoping that they're lower, but I don't think so. They're probably closer to 30%, I would guess. So you're already taking a group of highly traumatized individuals. And now here comes law enforcement. And again, I'm not painting them in a bad light, but it's just the frequency of interaction and exposure that one has increases the likelihood that there will be a negative outcome in terms of interaction with the criminal justice, representatives of the criminal justice system. Ken, did you want to add anything here?
Nope, not to that.
I'm going to let you take over this one.
Okay. So, boy, there's a lot.
Because I know you love to talk about the war on drugs and stuff, and I can go off of my own bias tangent, and I'm going to let you do that right now.
Well, there's I saw a great question come in what came first, the increase in crime or the increasing policing, and I don't know the answer. I'd love to. I would love to give you a well-documented answer on that. Stay tuned.
Well,
we need to do something else in this area about it.
So the way, and I just want to tap on current events, or this happened years ago, but to tap on what has recently come to light. Not to sensationalize a person's death at all, but Breonna Taylor, who was killed, and her unborn child was also killed due to a no-knock warrant, which had no basis. That was a part of a place-based policing intervention or program. And that community was targeted for redevelopment. So like we have to be, and I would say do your own research, okay? Do your own research. I got it from the internet, but it was from a reliable source. It was from news sources that are not fake news. But do your own research, but we have to be mindful that these things happen out there. Have to be.
If my knee-jerk reaction to Lori's question is that I think these things are cyclical. I think there's a rise in something, so there's a reaction from law enforcement, and then that results in a bunch of other things. So you see on the graphic here, the war on drugs. I didn't realize it went back that far back. I always thought it was a Reagan thing, but it started in 1971 with Richard Nixon. I think it came on again with the crack epidemic in the cities. So it got to the point where, and this isn't on here, I can't remember if we actually have more people in jail than any other nation in the world, including China. Or a higher percentage, and it may be both. I'd have to look that one up. But what I do know is from working in the correctional setting, 9 of the 10 charges, the top 10 charges that people were in the jail for, were all drug-related charges. The lone exception was failure to pay child support. And I don't think you have to go too much of a stretch to think how someone who has an addiction is probably not paying their child support. So I wasn't completely convinced that wasn't a drug-related charge, even though it's not specifically in there. So the outbreak in incarceration rates, I mean, basically quadrupling. And of course, you can see the rates here. This intersectionality piece comes again. Of course, this disproportionately impacts males, and it particularly impacts males of color. And in a related story, those numbers are actually very similar in the psychiatric hospitals too. The civil hospitals are about 75% male, disproportionately people of color. And the forensic hospitals, 90% male. And I don't have the racial statistics for the forensic hospital. That's something, that's maybe a homework assignment for me. So you see it in not only, in the mental health system parallels the criminal justice system to a certain degree. The last piece I'll add about this is the war on drugs was renamed the war on addicts, and it was renamed the war on addicts by 2 very prominent people. One was Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a global expert on trauma, and the other one was George Carlin, who was a global expert on comedy back in the day. But
and marijuana.
So I see we're getting near the end.
Yeah,
so we want to make sure that we have time for questions. But something I really wanted to point out as part of what we were talking about is more important than the diagnosis, like psychiatric diagnosis. I think it's important to diagnose violence. And we were talking about this with some of the other behaviors. How do you diagnose a hoarding behavior? Is the person hoarding because they're psychotic? Are they hoarding because they've had all their stuff stolen? Are they hoarding because, environmentally it was what they needed to do? They came from a place of poverty. Those of you whose grandparents and great grandparents went through the Great Depression, you don't throw out a rusty pot. You might need that. and that was something that just came down as a consequence of being alive at a certain period of time. So the three types of violence are instrumental, psychotic, and reactive. So instrumental violence this is violence with an agenda. This is, you're going to let me go get these cigarettes, or you're going to have a problem, or you're going to prescribe my Xanax, or I'm going to trash the place, or give me my Arby's and you're going to have a good night. So this is the more forensic, antisocial type of violence. Number two is psychotic violence. Psychotic violence comes right out of the symptoms. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Whether it's religiously themed or something along those lines, it comes right from mania, it comes right from the voices of the delusions. And the last is reactive violence, which is, it's almost more of impulse control related or more stressor related. It's immediate and it's in the moment. So if you have someone that commits an act of violence and 5 minutes after they do it, they're really sorry, but it's going to happen again, that's more like this. And it's something that happens more online. So the reason we make this distinction is that we usually react to the violence itself without saying, okay, well, where did this come from? Did this come from because the person heard a voice telling them to do it? Did they do this because they thought they could get over on somebody if they did it? Or did they do this because something happened 5 minutes before and they just reacted to it extremely poorly and they just didn't have the coping skills to manage what it was? So in the hospital, we're spending a lot of time on this. And from a residential perspective, I would as well. The source of the violence is every bit as important as the violence is, because again, it's the symptom and the cause, right? If you address the symptom, you don't address the cause, it's just going to come back again at another time and place. So, and I think this fits in the context of what we were talking about, what's coming from a place of PTSD, what's coming from a place of symptomatology, what's coming from a place of, hey man, this worked in the environment where I was. Where I was, having a swastika on my face was actually a good thing. However, out in the street, it's not going to help me in a job interview so much. So now the environment has changed, the person has to change with it. And sometimes the better you are as an inmate or an inpatient, the worse you are at being a citizen or a resident. And that's not an easy transition. What do we have next? Still watching time here. So the last thing, and we're not going to do this justice, if you're interested in the videos that we have on our site, we have one on something called 3 Steps to Safety. And this goes into this in a little more detail. And basically, and you already do some version of this without knowing it. This is just about kind of putting a structure to it. And that is, when someone's upset about something, instead of just coming with the rules, first and foremost, let's first relate to that person as a person. And that's the validate part. The validate part is, I understand that you're angry. I get why you feel this way. I get why you're wearing 6 coats and it's a hot day. I understand. Or tell me more about what that is so that you can get to understand it better. So that first part is validating, just relating to the person as a person. The second one is to explain. And that is look, man, we don't have to go out. We don't have to wear the 6 coats. We're going to Social Security. Don't need you to wear the 6 coats to Social Security in August. You keep them here and they'll be here when you get back. And then the last part is the problem solve. What can you do to help make that situation better for them, safer for them? We in the hospitals, we refer a lot to something as a bank account. Every interaction you have with somebody, if it's a good interaction, it's like you're putting money in that relationship bank account. If you respond to somebody by it's just something as simple as their name. What do they like to be called? In my family, we have lots of people who go by their middle names. I don't know why. This has been going on for generations. So, but if you call them by their first name, you've already sort of distanced yourself. That's not what that person's called. So, all of those little things, by asking, hi, how's somebody doing? By helping them with little stuff. All of that stuff is an opportunity to put something in a bank account. And then when that person has a crisis or a problem, or if you have to give them a directive, now you got a balance to draw from, because what you don't want is you don't want your checks to bounce. Checks bouncing is where violence can sometimes happen. So I would definitely recommend looking at the 3 Steps to Safety thing in a little more detail to get into this. But the important piece is just relating to that person. Is don't go right to the rule first. Get to the point where I get why you feel the way you feel. It's okay to feel the way you feel. Doesn't change the rule, but you're at least leading with that humanity part first, because your role with that person is more than just a job title, just like they're more than just a name to you.
All right. So guys, I'm wondering, Ken, if you might be able to Would you be able to post our YouTube link? I can't, the direct link to the SHPRI YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I can't do that without like closing out the PowerPoint and all that fun jazz. It's the fun thing about
Gotcha.
sharing the PowerPoint. So we just want to kind of summarize. I know that we talked about a lot of stuff today, and a lot of it was kind of superficial. So again, that's why we're pointing you in the direction of either our website, which you can navigate to the trainings tab, and within that trainings tab, you'll see a lot of resources that are available to you, a lot of videos. You'll see Ken in most of those videos, a couple. But there's a lot of videos there. Many of them are fairly short, like less than 20 minutes. So they'll give you a little bit more about this stuff without taking up your whole afternoon, right? So there's a lot of resources there. And then Ken's going to pop our YouTube channel in, which has probably about 40 videos as well, maybe more. And you'll see things maybe expanded a little bit there that we didn't get to touch on. So we just wanted to sum up by saying there are obviously a lot of reasons why people get involved in the criminal justice system. These can be individual choices, they may be societal issues, and also institutional, right? So there may be behaviors that people learn in institutions that don't serve them the best out in the community. Stigma can be external, but also some of the more damaging is when we adopt it and believe it. So internal stigma can be very damaging, even more so than the experience of psychiatric symptoms. We know that through research on intersectionality, certain groups of people are seen as more or less desirable, and where those less desirable societal aspects converge, people can experience a compounding effect of some of the stigma that they incur. People with mental illness and forensic issues are in correctional facilities, mental health facilities, and in the community, right? And so I think that somebody had mentioned, it sounds like there needs to be a lot more mental health services in the jail settings. Yes. Yes, there's a lot of cross institutionalization that happens. And I think that if we get better at addressing those mental health symptoms, the first time somebody interacts with the criminal justice system, we're going to be less likely to have repeat offenders, and we're going to be less likely to have individuals who wind up homeless and possibly dead or in state facilities. We outlined some of the differences between the colloquial terms of psychopath, sociopath, and why we don't like to use them so much, and antisocial personality disorder, some of the challenges in service provision. So keeping in mind some of those behaviors that you do need to guard for, things like grooming. I think Ken really explained that very well, and the importance of sticking with your herd, sticking with your pack. There's a reason why wild animals who have survived for millennia continue to survive. Those tend to be pack animals. So really lean on your pack, on your herd of teammates and other professionals, coworkers that you have in your circle for that support, and supervision is so important and restorative. So we want to thank you for joining us for today. Just to wrap up, we appreciate your time, attention, and participation. The webinar, as always, was hosted by DBHR through the Healthcare Authority. And we'd like to remind you that slides, a link to the recording of the session, and other resources will be made available in a follow-up email coming from the Healthcare Authority. Don't forget to check out the Washington Healthcare Authority's Foundational Community Supports newsletter for all stuff FCS and any upcoming training events. And there is information on this slide, and it will be in the handouts that will be provided to you with the email on becoming a Foundational Community Supports provider if you are not already one. So thank you so much. We have a lot of resources here, or references for you. Here's a cute little picture of our website. It looks a little bit different now, but go ahead, Ken. I think you wanted to
Just move back one slide to the references for a minute, if you would.
Sure thing.
I just wanted to point out that the Williams Crenshaw, if you go to that link and that aspect, that she's sort of the pioneer of the whole idea of intersectionality. You're going to get a much better explanation of what it is and how it works from her materials than you're going to get from us. So I just wanted to point that out. That's a great next step if you have questions about that.
Thank you, Ken. And so I just want to close by saying thank you to all of you for everything you do. I know firsthand, Ken knows firsthand, you do not have easy jobs, but you do have occasionally very, very rewarding jobs. And so I want to challenge you to think about the reasons why you got in this field. Most of us come to it with a very deep purpose. And so I want to thank you and challenge you to try to remind yourself of that and all the great stuff that you have done and will do. So thank you. And we're going to wrap up for now. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Thanks for coming.